I don't know where to start because I'm still trying to understand it myself. Maybe writing it down will help. I rented the cabin because I needed a break from everything: work, the city, people. It was an old wooden place, deep in the woods, far from any town. The kind of cabin you imagine when you hear about someone wanting to escape from the world for a while. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a radio, a fireplace, and a few old books. That was the appeal. I arrived in the afternoon, my car kicking up dust on the narrow gravel road. The trees swallowed the sunlight, making everything dim even though it wasn't close to sundown yet. The cabin sat in a small clearing, a single-story structure with a slanted roof, a front porch, and a stack of firewood piled against the side. A small lake was visible through the trees behind it. Everything was as I expected: isolated, quiet, perfect. I unloaded my stuff, locked my car, and went inside. The air was thick with the smell of wood and old fabric. Dust floated in the light filtering through the small windows. The furniture was simple: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch that looked older than me, and a fireplace with a stack of logs beside it. There was a single bedroom with a small bed, a dresser, and a nightstand. The kitchen was basic: an old stove, a small fridge, a few cabinets. I checked everything, making sure it was as described. It was. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire, read an old book I found on the shelf, then went to bed early. I didn't sleep well, though. It wasn't anything specific at first, just a feeling, like my body knew something was off before my mind did. I woke up several times, staring into the darkness, listening. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant animal sounds, just silence. I told myself it was normal. Maybe this deep into the forest, the animals had learned to stay quiet. The second day, I walked around the property. There was an old trail leading deeper into the woods, barely visible under the fallen leaves. I followed it for a while, but after about half an hour, I started feeling uneasy. I can't explain why. It wasn't fear exactly, just a wrongness in the air, like I wasn't supposed to be there. I turned around and walked back. That night, I heard something. I was lying in bed when I noticed it. Soft, deliberate footsteps outside. Not an animal. Animals move unpredictably. This was slow, steady. A person's footsteps. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped near the front porch. I waited. Nothing. After a long time, I convinced myself it was my imagination. Maybe the wind, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But when I woke up the next morning, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The dirt in front of the porch had been disturbed. Long, deep marks, like someone had been dragging their feet. There were no footprints, just those long, uneven marks. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a deer kicking up the dirt as it walked. I didn't believe it, but I wanted to. The third night was worse. I made sure to lock the door and shut the curtains. I sat by the fire, pretending to read, listening. At some point, I dozed off. A sharp creak snapped me awake. The front porch. A single step. Then another. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Another step. Closer. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking up to the pale morning light creeping through the curtains. I checked outside. The marks in the dirt were worse. Deep, erratic, like someone had been dragging something heavy. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. That was the day I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, threw everything into my bag, locked the cabin, and walked to my car. The air felt thick, heavy, wrong. Like the woods were holding their breath. I opened my car door. That's when I saw it. On the back window, written in the dirt, were 3 words: "Don't come back." I didn't. I got in, started the engine, and drove. Fast. I never told anyone. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. I never should have gone to that cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. Work had been grinding me down, and I needed some space to breathe, away from the city, away from the constant noise. My friend Ryan had mentioned an old family cabin deep in the woods, a place his uncle used to own but had been left abandoned for years. He told me it was still in decent shape, nothing fancy, but perfect if I wanted to be alone. I took him up on the offer. The drive was long, the roads becoming more narrow and rugged the further I went. The last stretch wasn't even a road anymore, just a dirt path cutting through thick forest. I had to slow down to a crawl, my tires kicking up mud and dead leaves as branches scraped against the sides of my car. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The place looked exactly like what I had expected, old but not falling apart. The wooden walls were weathered, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the porch creaked under my weight when I stepped onto it. The door was locked, but Ryan had given me a spare key. The lock was stiff, and I had to jiggle it for a few seconds before it finally turned. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. A single room with a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a bed pushed up against the far wall. There was a door leading to a tiny bathroom, but that was it. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. No electricity. Ryan had warned me about that. I set my bag down and checked the cabinets. A few rusted cans, an old pot, nothing useful. I had brought my own supplies anyway, enough to last the weekend. There was a stack of firewood by the stove, and I started a fire to warm the place up. The crackling flames gave off a soft glow, flickering against the walls. Outside, the woods stretched in every direction. Thick trees, dense undergrowth. I hadn't seen another house for miles on my way in. No cell service either. It was complete isolation, exactly what I had wanted. That first night, I slept lightly. Every sound outside made me stir. The wind in the trees, the occasional rustling of animals moving through the underbrush. At one point, I swore I heard something larger, something deliberate, footsteps crunching on dried leaves just outside the cabin. But when I sat up and listened, everything was silent again. The next morning, I found tracks in the mud near my car. They weren't animal tracks. Too wide, too long. Person had been out there. I tried to tell myself it was probably a hiker passing through, but I knew that didn't make sense. No one would be out here. No one even knew I was here except Ryan. I spent the day trying to shake the unease. I went for a walk, but the woods felt different now. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. Every now and then, I got the distinct feeling that I was being watched. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone standing between the trees, but there was never anything there, just the endless forest. That night, I barricaded the door. I dragged the small table in front of it, wedged a chair beneath the handle. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I kept the fire going, not wanting to sit in total darkness. Then, sometime deep in the night, I heard it again. The slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The steps moved around the cabin, circling it. Not fast, not hesitant, just steady. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped near the front door. Silence. Then the doorknob rattled. A slow testing turn. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a rusted fire poker, and gripped it so tightly my knuckles went white. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Then, nothing. Just silence again. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gripping the poker, staring at the door until the first light of morning seeped through the cracks in the walls. When I finally found the courage to check outside, there were more tracks in the mud. The same long, human footprints. They led from the woods, circled the cabin, and then disappeared back into the trees. I wanted to leave. I packed my bag, threw it into the car, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood, pretending I knew what I was looking for, but it was useless. I was stuck. I spent the next day inside, barely eating, barely moving. I kept the fire going, kept my back against the wall. The daylight felt safer, but I knew the night would come again. And so would whoever was out there. And they did. That night, the footsteps came back. Louder this time, more deliberate. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, gripping the poker so tight my hands ached. Then, a sound that made my stomach drop. A whisper, low, almost a breath. I couldn't make out the words. Then something slid under the door. Piece of paper. My hands were shaking as I reached for it. Scrawled in messy, jagged letters was a single sentence. "You can't stay here." That was it. That was all I needed. As soon as the sun rose, I started walking. I left everything behind. My bag, my car, everything. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I walked for hours, pushing through the thick woods, my heart racing with every sound. I didn't stop, didn't rest. I don't know how long it took, but eventually, I stumbled onto a road. A real road. A passing truck driver found me, picked me up, and took me to the nearest town. I told him my car broke down. I didn't tell him about the footsteps, the whisper, the note. I just wanted to forget. Ryan swore no one had been out there. He said the cabin had been abandoned for years, that no one knew about it anymore. But someone did. I don't know who or what they wanted. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. And I don't ever want to find out. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to go to that cabin by myself. Maybe it was the stress of the city, the constant noise, the feeling of never really being alone but always feeling lonely. Or maybe it was the way the woods had always felt like a second home to me, a place I could escape to and let my mind breathe. Whatever it was, I made the decision, packed my bags, and drove deep into the mountains. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine. He'd mentioned it a few times, said it was remote, completely off the grid, no neighbors for miles. Sounded perfect. When he offered to let me use it for a week, I didn't hesitate. The thought of disconnecting from the world, from my job, my phone, everything, it felt like exactly what I needed. The drive up took longer than expected. The road twisted through thick trees, and the further I went, the rougher it got. By the time I reached the final stretch, I was navigating a dirt path that barely looked like it had been used in years. Tall pines loomed overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. It felt like I was driving into a place forgotten by time. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly how I imagined. Small, simple, made of dark wood that had started to weather with age. There was a wraparound porch, an old rocking chair, and a stack of firewood against the side. Felt abandoned, but not in a bad way. More like it had been waiting for someone to return. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and made my way inside. The air smelled of dust and wood. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that settles deep in the walls. There was no electricity, just a gas lantern, a wood-burning stove, and a fireplace. I dropped my bags by the couch and started unpacking. Food, bottled water, a knife, a flashlight, a few books. Everything I needed for a quiet week alone. That first night, I felt uneasy, but I chalked it up to being in a new place. The silence was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of the city. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I built a fire, made some food, read for a while. Eventually, I went to bed, listening to the sound of the forest outside. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that flickered across the walls. I listened, heart pounding for no reason. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, somewhere outside, near the porch. I held my breath, straining to hear more. A raccoon? A deer? The footsteps moved, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I sat up, heart hammering. I grabbed the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to make a sound. The footsteps stopped by the front door. A long pause. Then the sound of something brushing against the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then more minutes. Finally, the sound faded, whatever it was moving back into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting. Nothing else happened. Morning came, and with it, the false sense of safety that daylight brings. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. I pushed it down and went about my day. The second night was worse. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. I woke up again around the same time. The fire was lower than before, barely more than glowing embers. The cabin was pitch dark. I listened, heart pounding. The footsteps were back, closer this time, slower. Something brushed against the window. I gripped the flashlight, knuckles white, but I still didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was awake. Then came the worst part, the sound of the doorknob turning. I almost screamed. My entire body locked up. The knob twisted, rattled, then stopped. Silence. My breath came in short, shaky bursts. Then, the slow sound of footsteps moving away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the couch, knife in hand, waiting for the sun. When it finally came, I packed my bags. I had planned to stay a week. I lasted 2 nights. I never saw what it was, never found footprints, never got an explanation. But as I drove away from that cabin, my hands tight on the wheel, I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't supposed to be there, that something had been watching me, and that if I had stayed just one more night, I might not have left at all. I should have never gone to that cabin. That much is clear now, but at the time, it felt like the perfect escape. A week alone in the woods, far from the stress of work, the city noise, the endless distractions. Just me, the trees, and silence. That was all I wanted. I found the place online. A small cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The photos showed a simple structure, wooden, old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a front porch that looked out over a small clearing. It had no electricity, no running water, just a well outside and an old wood-burning stove for heat. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to disconnect completely. The drive out was long. The farther I went, the thinner the roads became, from highways to paved country roads to dirt paths barely wide enough for my car. The last few miles felt like they took forever. Trees pressed in from both sides, so dense that even in daylight, the road felt dim. My GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and I was relying on a printed map. I double-checked it every few minutes, making sure I was still on the right path. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. Small, worn, but peaceful. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. There were no signs of recent visitors, but that made sense. The owner had told me it wasn't a popular rental, too isolated for most people. That was fine by me. I wanted to be alone. I unpacked quickly, setting my bags inside and lighting a few candles. The inside was cozy, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a single bedroom in the back. Everything creaked when I walked, the wood settling beneath my feet. I went outside to check the well, cranking the handle until cold, clean water splashed into the metal bucket. It was fresh enough to drink, just as the owner had promised. By the time I got back inside, the sun was already low. I started a fire in the fireplace, boiled some water for tea, and sat down with my book. For the first time in months, I felt truly relaxed. The first night was uneventful. The wind moved through the trees, making the walls groan slightly. I expected to struggle with the silence, but I slept deeply. It wasn't until the second night that I woke up suddenly, heart pounding, unsure why. Everything was still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. I listened, holding my breath. Then, just as I was about to roll over, I heard it, faint but clear, a single footstep, just outside the cabin. I sat up slowly, every muscle tensed. Could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But it had sounded deliberate, heavy, like a person. I waited, barely breathing. The silence stretched. Then, another step. Closer. My mind raced. I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Who would be out here in the middle of the night? The cabin had no locks, just a simple wooden latch on the inside of the door. If someone wanted in, they could get in. I reached for the poker by the fireplace, gripping the cold metal tightly. I sat in the dark, staring at the door, waiting. Nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the exhaustion won. I stayed awake as long as I could, but my body gave in, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. In the morning, I forced myself to go outside. I needed to know if I'd imagined it. The ground was damp from the night air, the soil soft enough to hold prints. There, just below the porch steps, was a footprint. A boot print. It wasn't mine. I had been inside all night. A wave of unease crawled over me. Maybe it was old, I thought. Maybe a hunter had passed through days ago. But I knew better. The edges were too sharp, the impression fresh. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. The woods, once peaceful, now felt suffocating. The trees seemed too close, the silence too deep. That night, I kept the fire burning high. I sat with my back to the wall, watching the door. Hours passed. The wind howled outside, making the cabin creak. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A footstep, then another. Slow, deliberate. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, yanked the door open, and shined the beam out into the trees. Nothing, but the feeling didn't leave me. Someone had been there, watching, waiting. I barely slept. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed quickly, tossing everything into my bag. I wasn't going to stay another night. The drive back felt longer. The road, once just an inconvenience, now felt endless, a trap winding deeper into the woods. My heart pounded every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the road behind me. When I finally reached the main highway, I felt like I could breathe again. The tension that had gripped me for 2 days eased slightly. But even now, weeks later, I still feel it. That prickle on the back of my neck, the sense that someone is watching. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know this. I will never go back to that cabin. And if you ever find yourself looking for a quiet escape, alone in the woods, be careful. You might not be as alone as you think. I don't know why I agreed to stay in the cabin. Maybe it was the price, way too cheap for a week's rental, or maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. Either way, I took the offer without thinking too much about it. It was deep in the woods, isolated, quiet. That was all I needed. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky already turning a soft gray as the sun started to dip behind the treetops. The drive had been longer than I expected, winding roads leading me deeper and deeper into nowhere. The last stretch was a dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck, tree branches scratching against the sides as I crawled my way forward. The cabin finally came into view, a squat structure of dark wood, with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the silence. No traffic, no voices, nothing but the distant sound of wind pushing through the trees. I liked that. It felt like I was the only person in the world. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with a fireplace, a worn-out couch, a coffee table scarred with knife marks. The kitchen was little more than a counter and a rusty fridge that hummed too loudly. A single bedroom with a lumpy bed, sheets that smelled like old wood. The bathroom had a mirror cracked along the edge and a shower head that dripped at odd intervals. It wasn't comfortable, but I wasn't looking for comfort. I spent the first evening outside on the porch watching the woods. The sun had gone down completely now, and the trees were just dark shapes against the night sky. I could hear things moving out there, small animals, maybe a deer, but nothing big enough to worry about. I had a beer, let the night air settle over me, and eventually went to bed. I don't know what woke me up. There was no sound, no sudden noise, but something had pulled me from sleep. My first thought was that it was too quiet. The wind had stopped, the usual night sounds, bugs, rustling leaves, distant owl calls were all gone. I sat up, listening, but heard nothing. Just the slow, steady drip from the bathroom. I got up and walked to the front door, pulling it open just enough to look outside. The woods stretched out in front of me, completely still. My truck sat where I left it, covered in a thin layer of dust from the drive. I didn't see anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I checked around the cabin, looking for tracks or signs that someone had been near, but found nothing. Just the usual mess of leaves and twigs. I tried to brush off the uneasy feeling and went about my day. I spent the afternoon exploring the woods, following a narrow trail behind the cabin. The air was cool, the sky gray with thick clouds that never quite broke open. I walked for hours, letting my mind wander. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing, just trees, endless and unmoving. I decided to head back before it got too dark. As I neared the cabin, I saw something that made me stop. The front door was open, just a few inches, but it had definitely been closed when I left. My heart started pounding as I stepped forward. I hesitated for a second, then pushed the door open the rest of the way. Inside, everything looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. The air was heavy, the silence deeper than before. I checked the rooms, the kitchen, even under the bed, but I didn't find anything. No signs of forced entry, nothing missing, just the door open on its own. That night, I locked every door and window. I pushed a chair under the front door handle just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something outside, branches snapping, leaves crunching, faint, almost human sounds. The third day was worse. I woke up to find the chair I had wedged under the door handle tipped over. The front door was unlocked. I knew for a fact I had locked it. My skin prickled, but I told myself I must have forgotten, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I spent the day inside, keeping close to the fireplace. The air outside felt different, heavier, like the woods were pressing in. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It felt like something was listening, watching. That night I heard it, not just footsteps outside, but movement, slow, deliberate, something circling the cabin. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening. It was close, too close. My breath came in short, shaky gasps. My hand rested on the handle of the knife I kept on the coffee table, but I knew a knife wouldn't do much good if someone really wanted to get in. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside the window, watching, waiting. The next morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed up my things, grabbed my keys, and stepped outside. The air was thick with fog, the trees barely visible in the distance. I moved quickly, heart hammering in my chest. Then I saw it. Footprints in the dirt, leading from the trees to my porch. Bare feet, my stomach twisted. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing, just fog and trees. I didn't wait. I jumped into my truck, fired up the engine, and tore down the dirt road, branches snapping against the sides as I sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, where the trees thinned and the silence no longer felt like it had weight. I never went back, never asked for a refund, never told anyone what happened. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I still feel it, that silence. The kind that isn't empty, but full of something you can't see. Something that watches, something that waits. I don't know why I went up there alone. Maybe it was the need to get away from the noise of life, the stress, the endless cycle of work and screens and traffic. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could be alone, that I didn't need anyone. I had booked the cabin a month in advance. It was way out in the woods, far from any town, no nearby neighbors, nothing but trees and quiet. That's what I wanted, quiet. The drive up was long, about 4 hours, most of it on paved roads until I reached the final stretch, a dirt road that wound through the forest, narrow and uneven. The trees pressed in on both sides, branches arching overhead to block out most of the daylight. Felt like I was being swallowed. The deeper I drove, the more the world outside disappeared. No phone signal, no radio, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the distant sound of the wind moving through the branches. The cabin was small but sturdy, made of old, dark wood. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by dense forest. There was a porch out front with a single wooden chair and a pile of firewood stacked against the side. A stone chimney jutted up from the roof. It looked exactly like the pictures online. Simple, isolated, perfect. Inside, it was just as I expected. One main room with a couch, a small kitchen, and a wood stove for heat. A single bedroom in the back, barely big enough for the bed and a nightstand. The bathroom was even smaller, just a toilet and a shower stall. It smelled like wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in a long time. The first night was fine. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, sat on the porch for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. It was so quiet. No cars, no voices, no hum of appliances. Just the wind and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I went to bed early, the kind of deep sleep that only comes when you're far away from the world. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound outside. A soft, rhythmic creaking, like wood bending, shifting. I lay there listening, my mind slow with sleep. Could have been the trees, the wind, but it was steady, too steady. My first thought was that someone was on the porch, sitting in the chair, rocking. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. The creaking continued for a few more minutes, then stopped. Silence. The next morning, I found the chair slightly moved. Not much, just a few inches from where it had been. Could have been the wind, I told myself. I didn't think too much about it. The second night, it happened again. The creaking woke me up around the same time, that slow, rhythmic sound. My pulse pounded in my ears. I thought about getting up, looking out the window, but something in me said no, just stay still. And then it stopped again. In the morning, the chair had moved again, just a little. And there were marks in the dirt, faint scuff marks around it, like someone had been standing there, shifting their weight. I felt uneasy all day. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, that the wind was playing tricks on me. But something about it felt wrong. That night, I locked the front door, even wedged a chair under the handle just to be sure. I left the bedroom door open so I could hear everything. The creaking started again. Slow, steady. I gripped the blanket, my whole body tense. Then the sound changed. A soft, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across wood. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. The sound moved from the porch to the side of the cabin, then to the back. I heard soft thuds, like footsteps on the dirt. Someone was moving around the cabin, circling it. I barely breathed. I sat in that bed, frozen, for what felt like hours. And then silence. I waited until the sun came up before I moved. Outside, the chair was back in its original place, but the dirt around it was disturbed, footprints leading away into the trees. I should have left then. I should have packed up and driven out. But I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I was letting the isolation get to me. The fourth night was the worst. I barely slept, every noise making my skin crawl. The creaking came again, but this time it was louder, closer. Then a tap, soft, deliberate, on the bedroom window. My whole body went cold. The window was small, barely big enough for someone to fit through, but it was right by the bed, right next to me. Tap, tap, tap. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The tapping stopped, and then a low, slow exhale, right outside the glass. I finally moved, grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I stared at the window, expecting to see a face, a shape, anything, but there was nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When I finally got up the courage to go outside, I saw them, footprints, right beneath the window, and not just one set, multiple. They led back into the trees, disappearing into the undergrowth. I didn't pack. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my keys and got in my car, peeling out of there so fast that gravel sprayed against the side of the cabin. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was back in the city, surrounded by people, by noise, by life. I never told anyone. What could I say? That I heard noises in the night? That I saw footprints? That someone or several someones had been out there watching me? I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted. I just know that I'll never go back. I should have never gone up there alone. It was a stupid idea from the start, but I told myself I needed the isolation. Just a week to clear my head, to be away from the noise and stress of everyday life. The cabin was deep in the woods, a place I had rented online. Promised to be quiet, peaceful, and completely off the grid. That part was true. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, and the nearest town was a good 40-minute drive away. Perfect, I thought. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, stocked the little kitchen with the food I brought, and made sure the generator was working fine. The cabin had electricity, but only from the old gas-powered generator out back. The place itself was small, one bedroom, a cramped living room with a wood stove, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Smelled like old wood and dust, but I didn't mind. It was cozy in a way, and I told myself this was exactly what I needed. That night, I sat by the fire pit outside, listening to the wind move through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet. Living in the city, you get used to a certain level of background noise, cars, distant voices, sirens. Out here, there was none of that. Just the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt like something was waiting just beyond the tree line. Watching, listening. I brushed it off as paranoia and went inside. The first night was fine. I slept like a rock. The second day, I explored the area. I followed a trail that led deeper into the woods, past a dried-up creek and through patches of dense undergrowth. After a couple of hours, I found something strange. A cabin, older and more rundown than mine, its roof partially caved in. I stood there for a while, staring at it. Something about it made my skin crawl. There were no signs of recent activity, but the door was slightly ajar. I thought about going inside, but my gut told me not to. So I turned around and left, quickening my pace on the way back. That night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. The wind? An animal? I sat up, listening, heart pounding. Then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound, like something brushing against the cabin walls. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed still, straining to hear. Came again. Slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers along the wood. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and flicked it on, shining it toward the window. Nothing. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just a tree branch swaying in the wind, maybe a raccoon or a stray deer rubbing against the cabin. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me, even after I eventually drifted back to sleep. The third day, I felt on edge. I tried to enjoy my coffee on the porch, but every rustle of leaves made me turn my head. I told myself I was being stupid, letting my imagination get the best of me. I needed to shake it off, so I went for another hike, this time in the opposite direction. That's when I found them. Footprints. Not mine. Someone else's. They were fresh, leading from the woods toward my cabin. They circled around the building, stopping at the windows, the back door, the generator. Then they led back into the trees. I stood there, heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't seen a single person since I got here. Who the hell was out here, walking around my cabin at night? I hurried back inside, locked the door, and grabbed the hunting knife I had brought with me. I checked every window, every room. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind whistled through the trees, the cabin creaked, and at one point, I swore I heard something moving just beyond the porch. But when I shined my flashlight outside, there was nothing there. The fourth day, I decided to leave early. The trip wasn't worth it. I was supposed to stay for a week, but I couldn't take another night of this. I packed my bags and went to start my car. The engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. The battery was dead. That didn't make sense. I hadn't left anything on. I popped the hood, but I didn't know much about cars. Everything looked fine. Then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. The wires had been cut. Someone had done this. Someone had been out here watching me, creeping around my cabin at night. and now they had made sure I couldn't leave. I grabbed my knife and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I needed to think. I had food, water, and enough gas to keep the generator running for a couple more days. But after that, I was stuck unless I could figure something out. The nearest town was too far to walk before nightfall, and the idea of being out in the open with whoever was out there made my stomach turn. I barricaded the doors and windows with whatever I could find, dragged the couch against the front door, stacked chairs under the windows. It wouldn't stop anyone determined enough, but it made me feel slightly safer. That night was the worst. I sat in the dark, knife in hand, barely breathing. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't make a sound. And then, sometime around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful. I gripped the knife tighter. My heart pounded so hard I thought whoever was out there might hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside the front door. Then a long silence. And then the doorknob rattled. I held my breath. It rattled again, harder this time. Then a scraping sound against the wood, like a knife or something sharp being dragged across it. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to stay still. The door held. The barricade held. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. No footsteps retreating. No sound at all. Like whoever was out there was still standing on the other side of the door, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I forced myself to open the door. The porch was empty, but carved into the wood of the door was a single word. Tomorrow. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag, took the knife, and started walking. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I walked until my legs gave out, and then I walked some more. Hours later, I finally reached the road and flagged down a passing truck. I never went back for my car. Never went back for anything. Whatever was out there in those woods, I wasn't going to give it another chance. I don't go into the wilderness alone anymore, and I never will again. I don't know why I agreed to stay in the cabin alone. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride. Maybe I just didn't believe the warnings were anything more than old wives' tales meant to scare outsiders. Whatever the reason, I was here now, alone, with the nearest neighbor miles away. The place wasn't much. A small, weathered structure with a tin roof that rattled whenever the wind picked up. The inside smelled like damp wood and old dust, the kind that settled into cracks and corners over years of neglect. A single bedroom, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a bathroom that felt more like an afterthought than a necessity. The only source of heat was a rusted wood stove in the corner, and the only light at night came from a few oil lamps scattered throughout the rooms. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the radio if I could get it to work. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky already darkening under thick clouds that promised rain. The air was sharp with the smell of wet pine and the distant scent of burning wood, probably from one of the few other cabins in the area. I had enough food for the week, plenty of firewood stacked on the porch, and a hunting rifle left behind by the owner, just in case. The first night was uneventful. I spent most of it trying to get the fire going and making a dent in the canned food I'd brought with me. The quiet was unsettling, but not unbearable. It was just the sounds of nature, wind moving through the trees, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl. Normal things I expected. The second night was different. It started with a noise, faint at first, like something brushing against the outside walls. I thought maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe. I ignored it, went back to reading by the dim glow of the lantern. But the noise didn't stop. It got louder, closer. Something was moving around the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps circled the structure, crunching against the gravel and dead leaves. I held my breath, listening. The steps stopped near the front door. A long pause, then a quiet scraping sound against the wood. I grabbed the rifle, not sure if I should call out or stay silent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then, nothing. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I sat there, gripping the rifle, waiting. The silence stretched on, thick and unnatural. Finally, I forced myself to check outside. The porch was empty. The trees stood still, unmoving in the night. But something was off. The air smelled different, metallic, like blood. I shined my flashlight around, but saw nothing. Just the empty woods staring back at me. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every shift of the wind made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just an animal, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I found tracks around the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were human, barefoot. The imprints were deep, as if the person had been standing still for long periods, pressing down into the mud. They led into the trees but disappeared after a few yards. No sign of where they came from, no sign of where they went. I told myself to leave, to pack up and drive back to town. But I stayed. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to believe what I saw. Maybe I thought I was imagining things. Or maybe I was just too stubborn. That night, it got worse. It started again, the footsteps, the scratching at the walls. But this time, there was something new. A low, raspy breathing just outside the window. Slow, deliberate, like someone standing there watching me. My skin prickled. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then the breathing stopped, and the doorknob rattled. I aimed the rifle at the door, my hands shaking. The knob twisted once, twice, then stopped. Silence. Then a single knock. Not hard, not loud, just a soft, deliberate tap. Like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I didn't move. Another knock. Then another. The knocks kept coming, steady, unhurried, stretching on for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, they stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I sat there, gripping the rifle, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I found something on the porch. A single, bare footprint in the middle of the wooden boards, wet and red like it had been dipped in blood. But there was no blood anywhere else. Just the print, perfectly shaped, facing the door. Like someone had been standing there, waiting for me to step outside. I packed my things in minutes, threw everything into the truck and didn't look back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, just for a second. And in that second, I saw it. Someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me, not moving, just standing there, barefoot. I don't even know where to start. I'm writing this down because I need to, not because I want to. If I don't get this out, it's gonna sit inside me forever, festering, eating away at me. So here it is. It started when I decided to spend a weekend alone in my uncle's old cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. He hadn't been up there in years, and when I asked if I could use it to get away from everything for a few days, he barely even reacted. Just waved me off and told me to take whatever I needed, like he wanted nothing to do with it. I should have taken that as a sign. The drive up was long. The paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to barely anything at all. The trees thickened, pressing in on either side of the narrow path. I lost cell service about an hour before I arrived, but that was expected. It was part of the reason I'd come, to be away from all of it. The noise, the people, the world. Just me and the quiet. The cabin wasn't anything special. Just a simple structure with a wraparound porch, a rusting tin roof, and thick logs for walls. The windows were old, glass smudged from years of rain and dirt. There was a shed in the back, half collapsed, with rusting tools and an old generator. Inside, it smelled like dust and wood, the kind of deep, dry scent that settles into a place abandoned for too long. The furniture was basic. A creaky bed, a wooden table, a few chairs, a wood-burning stove. There was no electricity, no plumbing, just a hand pump for water and a fireplace for warmth. The first day was fine. I unpacked, got a fire going, and sat outside as the sun dipped below the trees. The silence was thick, the kind that presses against your ears. It was peaceful. I read for a while, made some canned soup on the fire, then turned in early. But the first night, something woke me. I don't know what it was. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the woods were still, but something had pulled me out of sleep and my instincts told me I wasn't alone. I listened for a long time, but there was nothing, just my own breathing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place, the deep quiet playing tricks on my mind. I lay back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the tree line, maybe 20 feet from the porch, the dirt had been disturbed. A shallow depression, almost like something had been dragged. No tracks, no footprints, just a smoothed out section of earth, like someone had wiped it clean. I stared at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe an animal? A deer or a bear rubbing against the ground. I wasn't sure, but I didn't like it. I spent the day hiking, trying to push the uneasy feeling aside. The woods were dense, the air crisp, the kind of place that feels untouched. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. More than once, I stopped, listening, certain I had heard something. A rustling, a snap of a twig. But every time I turned, there was nothing. That night, I locked the door. I don't know why. The place felt safe enough and I wasn't really worried about people. But something about the cabin, about the woods, made me uneasy. I kept the fire going a little longer than before, watching the flames dance. When I finally turned in, I left the hatchet by the bed. Again, something woke me. This time, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The sound was soft, almost deliberate. A light scrape against the porch, then silence. My blood went cold. I didn't move, barely breathed. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. An animal? The wind? Something else? I sat up slowly, straining to hear. Another sound, so quiet I almost missed it. A soft creak, like weight shifting on the old wood of the porch. I grabbed the hatchet, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. My body was screaming at me to do something, but I didn't know what. If I moved to the window, would I see something? Did I even want to? Minutes stretched. Silence. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I wanted to tell myself I imagined it, but I knew better. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke, the fire was out, the cabin ice cold. My body ached from sleeping stiff, still gripping the hatchet. Morning light filtered through the windows. I forced myself outside, half expecting to find something. But there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, just an empty porch and the quiet woods. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I didn't believe it. That day, I barely left the cabin. I sat by the fire, staring at the door, waiting. The third night, it happened again. This time, it was worse. The sound started earlier, just past midnight. A soft scrape, a creak, a faint, deliberate sound, closer this time. I could feel it, the presence of something just outside. My pulse pounded. I gripped the hatchet, heart hammering. Then 3 knocks. Slow, steady, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. I stopped breathing. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to do something, but I couldn't move. The knocks came again. 3, slow, measured. I wanted to look. I wanted to check the window to see what was out there, but some primal part of me knew that if I looked, if I acknowledged it, something would change. Something would happen. I didn't move. I sat in the dark, clutching the hatchet, waiting. Hours passed. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke, the sun was rising. I didn't hesitate. I threw my things into my bag, barely even checking if I packed everything. I didn't care. I yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch, ready to sprint to my truck. Then I stopped. The ground, right in front of the door, was wiped clean. No footprints, no marks, nothing. Like someone had been there, like someone had been waiting. I didn't think. I ran to my truck, started it, and tore down that dirt path so fast I nearly skidded into the trees. I didn't stop, not once. Not until I hit pavement, not until I had service again, not until I was hours away. I never told my uncle, never went back. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that something knocked on that door, and I was never going to open it. I didn't plan on staying in the cabin for long, Just a few days, enough to clear my head. Life had been pressing down on me like a weight, and when my uncle offered me the keys to his old hunting cabin, I took them without a second thought. A few days alone in the woods, no phone calls, no responsibilities, just silence. That was all I wanted. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The dirt road leading to the cabin was barely a road at all, just tire tracks cutting through the trees. The deeper I went, the less it felt like the modern world existed. The forest pressed in from both sides, dark even though the sun was still high. The air smelled damp, like wet leaves and old wood. When I reached the cabin, I wasn't impressed. It looked smaller than I remembered from my childhood, more rundown. The wood was warped and dark with age, and the single window in the front was clouded with dust. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and something faintly rotten. I found the source of the smell quickly: mice. Dead ones, mostly decomposed, in a trap by the kitchen counter. I tossed them outside and opened the windows to air the place out. The cabin had no electricity, only an old generator my uncle kept locked in the shed out back. I decided to leave it off for now. The last thing I wanted was to listen to the rattling hum of an engine all night. Instead, I set up a few battery-powered lanterns, then unpacked my supplies: canned food, bottled water, a hunting knife, and a .22 rifle. I didn't plan on hunting, but my uncle insisted I bring it. Just in case, he had said. By the time the sun started setting, the air had turned cold. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace, watching the flames flicker against the wooden walls. The sound of the wind outside was different here, heavier. It moved through the trees like something alive, making the whole cabin groan. I told myself it was just the wind and went to bed. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. Something had pulled me from my sleep, but I didn't know what. I stayed still, listening. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. The wind had died down. It was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. Then I heard it, a sound outside. Not the wind, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a bear, but I didn't believe it. I reached for the rifle, gripping it with both hands. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The isolation was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep. The next day, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been out there. My stomach twisted. The nearest town was almost 20 miles away. No one had any reason to be this deep in the woods. I told myself it was old, maybe even mine from the night before, but I knew that wasn't true. The tracks were fresh. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept the rifle close, double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. By evening, I was on edge, jumping at every creak of the old wood. When the sun set, I lit the lanterns and kept the fire going. I didn't sleep that night either. The sound came again. Footsteps, closer this time. I gripped the rifle so hard my hands ached. My heart pounded. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, listening. Then the doorknob rattled. I nearly pulled the trigger right there, but I forced myself to stay still. The door was locked. They couldn't get in. The rattling stopped. A long silence stretched out. Then the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until the sun rose. When I finally got the nerve to step outside, I found something new in the dirt. A single boot print, deeper than the rest, right outside the door. Like someone had stood there, waiting. I had planned to stay another few days. That changed. I packed up my things, made sure the rifle was loaded, and started the truck. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once, just to be sure. The cabin door was open. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I didn't stop driving until I was back on paved roads, until I saw other cars, other people. I never told my uncle what happened. I just handed him the keys and thanked him. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. I only know I won't be going back. I never wanted to go to the cabin in the first place. It wasn't my idea. My friend Mark had booked it for the weekend, a so-called retreat from the stress of everyday life. He bailed last minute because his girlfriend got sick, leaving me to either cancel the whole trip or go alone. I should have canceled. It was deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. A single dirt road led up to it, twisting through endless trees, the kind that swallowed sound and light. The cabin itself was small, old, the kind that had probably been standing for decades. The wood was dark from years of exposure, and the windows were fogged with grime. There was a porch with a single rocking chair that moved slightly in the breeze, though I couldn't feel any wind. Inside, it was basic. A fireplace in the corner, a couch that looked like it belonged in the 80s, a kitchen with outdated appliances. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air smelled stale, like dust and something else I couldn't quite place. There was only one bedroom with a bed that sagged in the middle. No TV, no internet, barely any cell service. Just me, the trees, and the long weekend ahead. The first night was fine. Uneventful, really. I made some canned soup, read a little by flashlight since the lights flickered too much to trust, and eventually fell asleep to the sound of rain tapping against the roof. It was peaceful, almost nice. Then the second night happened. It started with a noise outside, a crunch like footsteps in the leaves. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I told myself it was an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something normal. But then it happened again. Closer this time. Slow, deliberate steps. Human steps. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin. Silence stretched so long that I started to doubt I'd heard anything at all. Then the porch creaked. Someone was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. The glass was too grimy to see clearly, but I could make out a shape. A figure standing in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the porch light. Too still, too quiet. I didn't move. Neither did they. Minutes passed, or maybe just seconds that felt like minutes. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. Slow, heavy steps moving back into the trees until the sound was swallowed completely. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening, waiting. Nothing. Morning brought some relief. In the daylight, it was easier to convince myself that I'd imagined it, or that it really was just an animal. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints in the mud, large, barefoot, leading from the woods to the porch and back again. I should have left right then, packed my things, gotten in my car, and driven away. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably a drifter, someone passing through. Unnerving, sure, but not a reason to panic. I just had to get through one more night. I kept the fire going that evening, as if the light would keep me safe. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat with my back against the couch, facing the front door. The woods outside were quiet, too quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was gone, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, around midnight, the noises started again. This time, I was ready. Flashlight in one hand, a heavy fireplace poker in the other. I waited. The footsteps came, slow and steady, moving towards the porch. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat on my palms. Then, the sound of wood groaning under weight. They were back. I aimed the flashlight at the window, but the glass was too dirty to see clearly. I could only make out the outline of the figure standing just outside the door. Not moving, not making a sound, just standing. Then the doorknob rattled. I didn't breathe, didn't move, just gripped the poker tighter and waited. The rattling stopped. Another long silence. Then the footsteps again, retreating into the woods. That was it. I was done. I stayed awake until dawn, then threw my things into my bag and ran to my car. The footprints were there again, clearer in the morning light. Barefoot, human, leading from the forest to my door and back again. I didn't stop to think, didn't look back, just drove, faster than I should have, heart racing until I saw the first signs of civilization. I didn't even tell Mark about it when I got home. What could I say? That some barefoot stranger had been watching me from the woods? That they had come back twice? That if I had opened that door, I might not have come back? No one would believe me. I still don't know what I saw. Maybe it was just some lost person. Maybe it was something worse. But I do know one thing for sure. I will never go back to that cabin again.